If you had siblings when you were growing up, or maybe you have children now, or just been around kids, you probably hear kids at one time or another say, "That's not fair." One child gets to do something else, or one child is required to do something else, and the other one expresses their frustration, their indignation, their frustration. In fact, that's not fair. Well, we as Christians sometimes do that with God, and many people the world over do that with God. We cry out and we say, "God, that's not fair," because in our minds, we think we know what fair is. And yet, we don't always adjust our thinking to think like God does. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and we're answering the question, who is God? And we've been talking for the last couple days about the fact that God is righteous. In fact, Psalm 145:17 says the Lord is righteous in all his ways. Not just some of them. He's not just sometimes righteous. So even when God pours out his anger on the world because of their rebellion, he's still righteous in doing so. And when he exercises grace to us, even when I deserve tremendous judgment, perhaps, at least in my thinking, God's still righteous in doing that. The book of Job introduces a character by the name of Job from a long time ago. This is, from our point of view, about 4,000 years ago. And we have this man, Job, and the setup for this is that Job is a man that is upright. Now, the word that's translated upright is this word we've talked about, yasher. And it's not our word for righteous, but it's in that idea, communicates this idea of something that is right or righteous by looking at something that is straight, something that's level, something that's plumb. And Satan has come around to God, and God asks him, "What have you been doing?" And Satan says, "I've been wandering about to and fro on the earth." And if you put this together, what Peter says, he's hunting. He's looking for people that he might attack, not because he enjoys specifically attacking people, and I'm not defending him, but doing it primarily as an objective or a goal of attacking the character of God. And God says, "Well, have you considered my servant Job? Look, there's a guy, he's righteous." In fact, he calls him here, he says, he's blameless and he's an upright man. This is God's opinion. This is God saying this, fearing God and turning away from evil. Satan responds and answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his house and all that he has?" In other words, he says the only reason Job doesn't curse you, the only reason Job is a good guy, the only reason he's upright is because you make it worth his while. That's what he's saying. You pay him off. And so God allows Satan then to attack Job. First, through some horrible attacks, the first round that are horrible. They'd be devastating, in my opinion. It'd be devastating to me to go through all of that. But the second round, where he actually attacks Job personally in terms of his physical health, and boy, I think that would just put me in the ground. And yet in all of that, it says in Job 2 that Job did not open his mouth and he didn't curse God. And that word curse, by the way, interesting enough, is the word bless. And he didn't bless God. Probably bless in a kind of an oxymoronic sense, that he didn't open his mouth to say something bad about God when you would normally expect something good coming out of his mouth. He said he never did that. But as time goes on, this is for those of you unfamiliar with Job, Job's friends come to commiserate with him, and as they've watched him in his pain and his sorrow, eventually his friends open their mouth. And they do what people do. They do what we do. We see, and I had a friend that did this years ago. Somebody would be diagnosed with cancer, and they would say, "Oh, well, that person smoked. Oh, well, that person didn't take care of themselves. So that person worked at this business over there, and they were probably exposed to it." And they always were trying to come up with a reason for why they had cancer. And the reason they were doing this was because, well, I don't do that, so this won't happen to me. And this is essentially, in my understanding, what Job's friends do. They're going to go through and they're going to try to come up with a reason why Job has gone through all this horrible stuff. And essentially, Job's going to say, boy, what comforters you are. Because they basically are going to come now and they're going to, after sitting and commiserating with him for a while, they're going to try to find a reason that Job is suffering these things. And Job eventually kind of becomes a bit frustrated with theirs, and he begins defending himself. And Job himself kind of cries out for his day in court as though, God, tell me why this. I want to stand before you. I want to stand before your bar, and I want you to explain to me, why am I going through these things? And at the end of all of this, we have a young man that has sat and listened to all Job's friends and Job go on back and forth. And this young man says, okay, youth is supposed to sit and wait, but now I have to speak out. And this man, Elihu, is going to defend God. And he makes this statement. Verse 4, let us choose for ourselves what is right. And this is not a word for righteous. This is our Hebrew word mishpat, which means justice or judgment. So a proper judgment. Let us know among ourselves what is good. For Job has said, verse 5, I am righteous, but God has taken away my right. And this word right is that word mishpat, that judgment. In other words, I've been righteous, he says here, but I didn't get the right judgment. That's what he's essentially getting. I've been cheated out of proper judgment. Should I lie concerning my judgment? Because my wound is incurable. I mean, look at this. Look at how miserable I am. Though I am without transgression, I've never broken a law. And he's not talking about the Mosaic law because he was not a man under the Mosaic law. He's not an Israeli. In other words, he says, why am I like this? And this is Elihu referring back to Job. And then you go to Job 35 and verse 1, and Elihu continued to say, do you think this is according to justice? Do you say my righteousness is more than God's? In other words, he says, let me put this together. You think that this is according to proper justice and that it's because of your righteousness, because you're so righteous, in fact, more righteous than God, that you can actually say, oh, God owes me something. For you say, what advantage will it be to you? What profit will I have more than if I'd sinned? If I sinned, man, I'd be in the same predicament maybe. Maybe I'd be better. And I will answer you and your friends with you. Look at the heavens and see, and behold the clouds. They're higher than you. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? In other words, are you really reaching God by what you're sinning so that God has to smite you? So essentially what he's getting. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are many, what do you do to him? I mean, does it actually physically hurt God? If you are righteous, what do you give to him? By being righteous, how does God benefit from you being righteous? Or what does he receive? See from your hand. Your wickedness is for a man like yourself, and your righteousness is for a son of man. In other words, it benefits people down here. But it doesn't change God. God's not up there paying people off because they're good people. And yet this is exactly the problem that we have when we think of the righteousness of God. That we think the righteousness of God means God owes me something. I was good. Didn't you see that I was good? In fact, there's people in Christianity the world over, Christendom maybe we should say, that have the idea that, hey, I do these good things. God should make me prosperous. And so we have a prosperity message that's out there. And yet the scriptures are that God doesn't owe you a thing. He is still righteous, but his righteousness does not bind him to owe you anything. The only time God owes you anything according to righteousness is when he has promised that in exchange for this, he will do this. But Job doesn't have that promise. So we come to Romans chapter 9, and we come to a verse, and this is a loaded chapter. And if you go back and you find the playlist on stability in Romans, we touch on some of this a little bit. Not maybe in the depth that it deserves, but it's important. It's a very important passage, and it's an important passage that I really think it affects Christian maturity to come to appreciate the fact that we're not swaying God. We're not twisting God, and God's not sitting watching us trying to figure out how we're going to move, and then he's responding. And so verse 14 of Romans 9, what shall we say then? There is no injustice with God. And that word injustice it's simply a negative form of the word righteous. The word righteous in the New Testament is dikaios. That's a righteous person, dikaia. Dikaia is righteous and adikia is unrighteous. Pardon me for all the extra Greek there, but that's what he's talking about. There's no unrighteousness, I would maybe say, with God. Is there? May it never be. And may it never be means don't let it come to be. Don't think that way. Don't respond that way. For he says of Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. So that it does not depend on man who wills or desires. It doesn't, notice that. It doesn't depend on us or the man who runs. It depends on God who shows mercy. That's a hard thing for us to understand. But God is righteous in doing those things, but his righteousness isn't that I owe you something. It's not the way God operates. So when we're thinking about God's righteousness, it's real easy for us to go, oh, God's supposed to be righteous, but this isn't fair that I have to do this. This isn't fair that I'm sick. How come those other people are healthy? I've watched that happen with Christians, where sometimes other people that don't seem to be as good at Christians as somebody else, those people, they seem to go scot-free and not have problems. And then you get that believer that is really lived for the Lord, and they're struck with something where they're really sick. And they might be inclined to say, this isn't fair. Usually I don't hear them say that, because even though maybe they might think that in their mind, I have no reason to think so. Sometimes they're going through those things because, well, being a person that really appreciates God and is allowing God to work in their life, they're kind of like Job says at the beginning of his experience, shall we receive good things from God, shall we not also can come up to confront and take on evil things that come our way? God is righteous in all that he does. And our minds are not always able to wrap themselves around what God does in his righteousness, but be clear, God in his righteousness does not owe you anything based on some human standard of what you think is fair, what I think is fair. God is the one. It says it rests on God who has the mercy. And we could go through this chapter, and there's more things to be said in there. And it's not a fatalistic view. It is a view that God has a purpose, and the purpose is good. And the purpose is righteous, because is there unrighteousness with God? No, there's not. So stop and think about that. Maybe you need to be reminded of this. Maybe you're going through something tough and hard right now, and you need to remember, you know what? God, you are righteous in everything you do. And the things I go through, they are kind of tough at times. But you're not unrighteous in the way you're dealing with me. You remain righteous always. And worship him for this. With that, I wish you a good day in the Lord, and I thank you for joining me.